Everybody good? Sorry, just checking for everybody.
Can you take us through the Senate race from the first time you polled to now where it appears to be a dead heat?
Right.
What is going on?
Well, we've saw Nicholson with a single digit, but 7 or 9 point lead in March. It shrunk to 5 points last time and is now Vukmir by 2. We have a 7-point margin of error there, so the 2-point difference is well within the margin of error. But there has been a trend over the 3 polls to a narrowing of the race. And I think it'd certainly be fair to call it a toss-up race at this point, especially considering our margin of error. At the same time, neither of them have become substantially better known than they were, and so there's still lots of uncertainty about how they will break out, and 30% of Republican primary voters say they haven't made up their mind. So in that context, it's anybody's race, but it is one in which Vukmir is caught up, if you will.
Does TV make a difference, or what makes a difference typically between now and a primary?
I think the thing about television advertising is it's how a lot of voters encounter the candidates and become familiar with who they are, their names, and nothing else. And as you can see, with more than half unaware of the candidates, unable to say favorable or unfavorable, we surely have the opportunity for television advertising to clue people in. Now, there are other ways, like news media, for example, that will inform voters over these last 4 weeks. And frankly, lots of voters have other things to do in the summertime and will tune in late for the August primary. So that's partly advertising, it's partly news, and it's also the motivation of voters to pay attention and inform themselves about the candidates. But I do think we're looking at a sprint to the finish over the last 2 or 3 weeks before the primary.
Is the Democratic governor's race Tony Evers to win, or is that not a good assessment since no one's on TV yet?
I think Evers has shown not only the fact that he stands out away from the crowd in each of our 3 surveys, but has also increased his advantage over that period. But that said, a 31% of the vote now with 38 undecided is hardly a commanding lead. But none of the rest of the field has started to emerge, at least in the voters' responses, of breaking out into the teens, for example, or showing a real surge in voter awareness. With, again, 38 undecided, and the candidate's not that well known, it's possible the undecideds and those who don't know will converge around one candidate. Donald Trump took something like 2/3 of the undecided voters in the last week of the 2016 campaign, for example. So that could change. But we don't really know. Maybe it could change and advantage Evers. Maybe it could change and advantage one of the other candidates. Or maybe it just remains spread among them. So that's a long way of saying, I don't know. But I think the race is still lively because of that uncertainty and so many undecided voters. Evers clearly has an advantage, though, at this point.
In your history of doing polling on this and watching politics in the state, is it unprecedented how many people still don't know 3 to 4 weeks out who these candidates are?
It's maybe surprising, but if we looked at the Attorney General's race 4 years ago, we had over 60% who never acquired knowledge of the 2 Attorney General's candidates.
But it's governor.
I realize it's a governor's race, but my point is, even in a statewide general, it's perfectly possible to have large levels of unawareness. And for a party primary over a hot or vacation-y summer, it's not that surprising to see that we're still where we are. Having said that, it puts all the more pressure on the campaign and frankly on voters to tune in and make up their minds between now and August.
With the enthusiasm rating, would you say that there is a blue wave in Wisconsin, or you're able to classify that?
I think we'd call it a blue advantage right at the moment, but it's a moderate advantage, not an overwhelming advantage. I think any assessment of the wave-like nature of this election probably should wait into the fall as we see what's shaping up more in the national picture as well. Waves are much more a phenomena of the national mood and pressure, and then the states modify that one way or another. With 2 incumbents running statewide for governor and Senate, the wave might not matter as much here if voters focus in on the particulars of those 2 races. But national forces do lift and also drop support for parties. We just don't have a great sense of where the national thing is right this minute.
Harley's lost the public support on tariffs. That's sort of an amazing thing to see. What do you think's happened?
Yeah,
I realize you didn't ask what happened.
Well, we didn't follow up. I guess I would read it as there's a certain reluctance, certainly a big reluctance among Republicans to see the tariff change as something that had a negative impact here. Democrats are much more willing to see it that way. But I think the other part that's going on is a belief that has been built up over 20 or 30 years, if not more, that manufacturing is being pressured to move overseas anyway. That's part of the skepticism about free trade and about global markets. And so it's not too surprising that voters say jobs would have moved overseas regardless of the tariffs. Now, there's differences in party on that, but I think this broader picture of, sort of the default is jobs are going to leave the country is still part of that, and surely that is part of Trump's support on the trade issue as well. So I'm not sure it's all that much specific to Harley as it is part of the general skepticism about jobs being moved overseas.
Has President Trump lost independents in Wisconsin?
Well, he's certainly trailing among them with a job approval rating that's 12 to about 20 points more negative than positive among independents.
Did he have them, though?
He's not done terribly well among them in the time that he's been in office. Here in the state, though, about 25% of independents approve of the job he's doing. Nationally, it's been more like 35 or 34. So it does seem he's maybe a little worse off with independents here. But the one thing about independents is there's a lot of undecided people who haven't made up their minds. And that's because independents generally are less interested in politics, less involved with it. So you get a bigger don't know side of that. However, having said that, across multiple measures, independents on balance tilt against Trump rather than for him, with rare exceptions.
Who gets the blame? Who do voters blame for the bad roads up north or the west?
Well, I didn't ask, and that's actually the really interesting question, is whether you think that's a long-standing problem that is bipartisan, whether you think, you live in the land of ice and snow, you're going to have bad roads and it's nobody's fault, or whether there's actually finger-pointing to say, you could have fixed my roads and you didn't. This is really the political question that we'll see played out in the fall, is whether Democrats want to make an issue of roads, and if they think they can sell this as a matter to say the governor has not performed and not looked out for you up north, or whether they choose to go on to a different set of issues, and that's entirely in the campaign's hands. But I do think that there's been a lot written about the rural-urban divide here in Wisconsin, and I think this is a good example of where people think the reality that they live is noticeably worse or perceived to be worse in the northern and rural parts of the state.
Did we miss any headlines?
I'm sure I missed them, and therefore you missed them. But no.
Matt Flynn must have saw the numbers because he's going up on TV.
Oh, is he? Okay. I wish I could get a commission on that.